rather than keep you waiting, I'm going to start with Yezid Sayigh, our senior fellow in Carnegie Middle East Center, who actually I think needs no introduction, particularly to this audience. As you know, we're going to be talking about the prospects of political settlements in Syria. And I'm going to ask you, Yezid, if you could please start by placing, or at least giving us your assessment of what the prospects for a political settlement are in the context of current developments and all the different movements we've been seeing in Syria over the past few weeks, particularly the move in Raqqa, developments in eastern Syria, and so on and so forth.
Thanks. I was assuming I'd be the last to speak, but so maybe in a way it's just as well I'm the first, because the very short answer is I don't believe there'll be a formal political solution in Syria, i.e. A negotiated diplomatic outcome undertaken by external powers along with Syrian combatants, producing what we would normally think of as a power sharing arrangement. I just don't think this is going to happen. And to explain this, I mean, I want to come back to your question and put this in context of where things are heading now in Syria, because clearly there have been a lot of dramatic developments over the last 2 years, ever since the Russian intervention in particular, more recently the fall of eastern Aleppo to the regime, and the entry of Turkish forces into Syria, the developing battle against ISIS, and more recently, of course, the opening of a front in the Badia, the southeastern part of Syria, by US-backed opposition forces. So we seem to be going somewhere new, and for some people this signals either an imminent showdown between the main external actors who so far have operated via local proxies, the assumption being that Deir el-Zor is the new battleground of the Syrian conflict, the sort of the new flashpoint or main focal point where these powers will finally compete. You'll all have heard of the new narrative of the Iranian line, or Al-Khatt al-Irani, which supposedly will extend from Tehran all the way to the Mediterranean, with a lot of sort of geopolitical mapping, people assuming that Deir el-Zor is a critical part of this sort of Shia Iranian crescent type narrative that will eventually link up with regime-held areas in Syria and to Hezbollah in Lebanon. And therefore we sort of face this cosmic showdown of the Russians and the Iranians and the Americans and others. I don't think this is what we're looking at, but I just want to point out that clearly there is a new evolving situation. It's very hard at the moment to predict just where it'll go, how far will each of these actors go, and what do they really want, in fact. Others, of course, draw the opposite conclusion from the same facts, this being that the rush to get to Deir el-Zor will ultimately be the context for these external powers to work out some understanding about Syria, a deal, in other words. I also think this is not quite what's going to happen, nor do I think that any of these developments lead us into a revival, let's say, of the Geneva process, or lead the Astana talks towards some sort of formal political deal, in the sense we've understood so far as something that looks anything like, never mind the Geneva communique of 2012, but that looks like the Vienna communique or Vienna statement of November 2015, which in a way superseded that earlier document in effect. So my sense is that we're in a very different place, and if I may, I'll just keep extending my analysis of where things are going in order to come back maybe a little bit later to the actual politics of this. So if you look at Deir el-Zor, I mean, I'm going to start with that, the narrower issue in a way. I think there's a lot of rather simplistic analysis and simplistic narrative about the Syrian opposition, Jaish Maghawir al-Thawra, the new sort of Syrian fronts, etc., are going to move in. They just announced yesterday setting up a new base another 60 kilometers from their previous base in the Al-Tanf area on the Jordanian border. And it all looks very impressive and dramatic. But the core questions, I think, are ones that people aren't addressing. I'm sure they're being addressed by military planners, certainly in the Pentagon and elsewhere, to control Deir el-Zor, which ISIS is probably turning into a major stronghold, precisely because it's closer to Iraq, closer to Mosul, and the last possibility it has for surviving. The battle, therefore, there is going to be much harder, and the key questions are, who has the manpower on the ground and the ability to advance to the populated areas of Deir el-Zor province? Never mind the Badi. People can play cowboys and Indians in the desert for the next years. I mean, after all, the regime and ISIS have been playing this game of back and forth around Tadmor, Palmyra, and the gas fields around Palmyra for something like 2 years, 3 years, and they're still playing it. So the real question is, who enters Bou Kamal, Mayadin, and the towns and villages up the river all the way until Deir el-Zor city? Who has the ability, logistical ability, and the manpower, the numbers, to move into these areas, defeat ISIS in these areas, and then hold and maintain their control of these areas? That is the challenge that we don't hear discussed much. I'm sure military planners all over are thinking very carefully about this, precisely because you can do a lot of shadow theater and sort of stage play in the areas in between, in the Badia. The regime moves up along the border, the US strike a convoy and stop it advancing any further. But beyond this, the real battle isn't here, the real battle is over there. The regime is trying to advance from Palmyra towards El-Sukhna, which is the key to get to Deir el-Zor. But it too lacks the manpower, because otherwise it would have done this a long time ago and made that advance and relieved the siege of Deir el-Zor. And right now it's caught between finishing the battle for the Eastern Ghouta in Damascus, between a counteroffensive that may be coming soon in Dar'a, between pushing westwards from Aleppo city into the western parts of the province, or putting the pressure on Idlib province, or instead, now that it's taken over the last ISIS pocket between Tabqa and Aleppo and Maskana, does it start moving east to lay a claim to Raqqa? Otherwise, it could see Raqqa handed over to some other power. And this would be the first provincial capital in Syria to fall, so to speak, since Idlib city. And this time it will fall to externally backed powers with the direct involvement of the US, of Russia, of Turkey in one way or the other. And that's a different kind of ballgame. So I don't think the regime is going to take the outcome of the battle for Raqqa as something ordinary. So given all this, I don't think the regime has the ability at the moment to fight for Deir el-Zor, to push ground troops in sufficient numbers as far as Deir el-Zor city, enough to push back ISIS in the city, while retaining its position and its offensive options further west. So everyone is stuck in this position. I don't think the US intends to put its troops on the ground in and around Deir el-Zor. I also don't think that the US necessarily wants to reach that stage in Deir el-Zor. I'll finally add there that we also hear a lot of talk about the Iraqi Popular Mobilization Forces, Al-Hashd al-Sha'bi, who are announcing that they're moving towards the border and that they may enter the battle, i.e. cross the border into Syria to take part in the fighting. But if you look at the map once again, in order to get anywhere near Deir el-Zor, they have quite a distance to go, and they're still up against a buffer zone of ISIS-controlled territory. And I don't think that the idea that they're going to arrive at the border near Deir el-Zor anytime soon is actually that realistic. We're talking at least about, say, 6 months ahead for any of these actors to develop that kind of ability and to project the battle into Deir el-Zor province or city itself. So I want to wrap up that sort of battlefield assessment with an observation, because I want to come back from all this to the political implications. and the implications for a political solution. I think Raqqa, the battle for Raqqa, is more interesting and more significant in that sense, in the short term at least. Because if you think about it, once, and I think it is a matter just of time, once ISIS loses Raqqa, the real question is who then controls Raqqa? The Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, well, the Turks have been making it clearer and clearer that they are really unhappy with this prospect. And although it's really difficult for them to intervene militarily directly in the battle for Raqqa, because there's a certain distance, and that means going directly in against Kurdish forces, being armed and backed by the US. The US and the Russians have both done flagging exercises, you'll recall, around Manbij. When the Turks looked like they would push in towards Manbij, the Russians and US basically said, our troops are on the line, so don't come in. What can Turkey do? It's not clear. They have threatened to come into Idlib province and create a safe zone and deal with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, formerly Jabhat al-Nusra. They could raise the tension around Manbij. So I think for the Kurds to take over Raqqa, it's not an easy one. I know that governments in the West are preparing stabilization plans for Raqqa for once ISIS goes, so as to create local councils, local civil administration, police, etc. The Turks have about 6,000 policemen now that they've trained in the Jarablus area. That's a huge number for Jarablus. They could easily be preparing them to extend into other areas, and Raqqa could be one of them. But for them to deploy in Raqqa would need the cooperation and agreement of the Kurds at least, and of course of possibly, help by the Americans and probably the Russians. So we're looking at a complex politics in which at least two questions arise. One is, what will the US position be? Does the US actually have a policy? And I want to suggest here that just because the US has become far more active in the south of the country does not tell us much about a new US policy. I don't think the US has a new US policy vis-a-vis the Syrian conflict, vis-a-vis the Assad regime. I think bottom line is Trump does not actually have a clear policy. And his policy, such as it is to focus on the fight against ISIS, because that's what plays well inside the US. He can say, I'm delivering what Obama failed to deliver, and I have increased the military effort. And we know that since the middle of February, there's been a very significant increase in US military and intelligence assets in northern Syria, in Turkey, and now in Jordan. But what he's done is he's left operational decisions to the military, and he boasts publicly about this all the time, whether it's in Afghanistan or elsewhere, that I've got great generals, I'm not going to get in the way, they can do their job, they'll decide what needs to be done, so they'll do it. So in a way, I think we have a dual position here, where there's the US administration at the political level has no particular goal and is simply going along with events as they evolve, beyond this general idea that we're worried about Iran, we're friends with the Saudis and the Egyptians, but they don't have, I think, a clear policy on Syria. The military, there's a risk, therefore, of mission creep, that the military could expand their role, and then it expands until it creates political realities. However, I think the military will have very practical operational considerations on their mind, namely the ones I suggested, which is operating in Deir el-Zor could be highly problematic, could lead to a situation where the opposition groups they support do not actually have the ability to take towns and then keep hold of the towns and move on to new towns. And therefore, the US finds itself either supporting a failed effort or having to get more deeply involved. And I think that's something US military planners will not want to do. They have more influence in Baghdad, and they could work on keeping the popular mobilization forces away from the border more easily, maybe that way, than by staging operations in Deir el-Zor. So I'll finish by saying the other question that needs to be answered on the back of what happens to Raqqa is, where is the Assad regime in all of this? I mean, the Russians are clearly being very cautious and careful. But does that mean that they would be comfortable seeing Raqqa taken from ISIS and then handed over to adversaries of the regime? I'm not convinced that's something the Russians will be on board for. Does that mean allowing the regime into the city? Well, that's difficult for all sorts of practical and logistical reasons. But on the other hand, the Manbij Council arrangement, in which the regime, the PYD, reached an agreement thanks to the Russians allowing the regime to resume some sort of civilian role in Manbij, which was not under the physical control of the regime, we may find some sort of hybrid, but a hybrid that involves a clear regime role. And if that happens, then that tells us more about US policy, that the US may be willing, in fact, to have a modus vivendi, a coexistence arrangement, a tacit one, in Raqqa. And if that is what emerges out of all this, then I think we'll be much clearer on where US policy is or is not going. And that leaves us finally with my wrapping up comments, and I'll have made my full presentation this way, that all of this doesn't lead us back to laying the ground for a formal political solution, in my view, for a reason that has never changed, which is I think the Assad regime is unwilling and unable to legitimize the Syrian opposition in a formal power-sharing agreement, because in that case, people could rightly say to it, then why did we have to fight this same opposition for 5 or 6 years and destroy the country? Second, a formal negotiated deal reached through foreign diplomacy as opposed to an internal reconciliation discussion cedes authority, it acknowledges the power and the standing of international actors and international law over what the Syrian regime insists is a domestic sovereign affair. And so I think both of these are seen as fundamentally threatening to the regime and therefore more than problematic, as dangerous. And so long as they now hold the main cities of Syria, a very significant majority of the population, they're more stable within their own regimes, given all the problems they have, and they're en route to solidifying their control around Damascus, and they're unlikely to lose Russian support no matter how much they disagree on whether or not to have a political solution. Given all that, I think the Assad regime is in a position to maintain its current stance of not going for a formal political solution and therefore continuing the conflict. So I think we're still looking at 1 or 2 more years of this kind of conflict, many more phases, complex dynamics, but a new kind of equilibrium in which every move by one actor is countered by another move by another actor, and we end up where none of the actors are sufficiently committed or sufficiently strong to take us to a clear, definitive decision, whether military or political. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Yezid. I'd like to welcome our 2 speakers. Ustaz Mohamad, we're going to be switching to Arabic, and there's instant translation if people would like to get the, sorry? Yeah, if you'd like to raise your hand if you need headphones, and we can get them to you. Okay.
Welcome, Mr. Mohamad Sarmini, Director of Jusoor Center for Studies, and Mr. Obeida Nahas, Director of the National Renewal Movement. We are sorry, but we had to start before your arrival. Our colleague Yezid spoke about his own opinion regarding the latest developments on the field in Syria. He spoke about the prospects for a political solution in Syria, saying that they are quite limited for the moment. So, Mr. Mohamad, could you please give us your opinion regarding the prospects for a political solution, namely in light of the Geneva and Astana talks? Thank you. Thank you, Maha. Thank you, Yezid. And I would like to thank the Carnegie Center for organizing this meeting. I'm sorry for arriving late. In fact, allow me to go back to the beginning of the Syrian conflict in March 2011. At that moment, it was a true popular revolution where Syrian citizens called for the change of the regime and called for putting an end to a dictatorship. The Syrian people wanted more freedom and more democracy at the beginning of this revolution. Yet, this was a cause for an armed conflict In June 2013, a meeting was held in Geneva in order to discuss a possible political solution. And indeed, the stakeholders reached the Geneva Agreement, stipulating that the United States and Russia met in order to agree on a political solution. But before that date, the Syrian citizens wanted to change the regime in Syria because this regime was considered as a totalitarian regime. At that date, the political ideas started shifting because the decision was not between the hands of the Syrian people anymore, because it took an international dimension, and it has been agreed that a transitional government will be established. And those two main stakeholders were allowed the capability of refusing any form of government should this government not reflect their own ideas and opinions. So they started discussing the form of this government while the conflict was still continuing and escalating. We had several meetings in Geneva until the last one that was held. So this is a political process that took place. But let us be realistic. At the end of 2015, even this agreement became impossible. This idea of a Syrian government became impossible, and the relevant stakeholders were unable to launch this transitional process. And this is why all these opportunities declined, and we started hearing about so these opportunities decreased. The possibilities of sharing power between the regime and the opposition. And this is what we have witnessed after the intervention of foreign powers, starting by Iran and followed by Russia. So this intervention changed the situation on the field directly and impacted the political process. And due to the fact that this political process shifted, the idea of Astana meetings emerged in order for us to be able to reach a more realistic approach. Because the persons who meet in Geneva talk about the future of Syria, the type of regime, the constitution, the elections, and all those topics that are discussed lately. Yet in Astana, we started discussing more realistic details. On December 30, 2016, the ceasefire agreement was signed between the four stakeholders, the opposition forces, as well as the regime, in addition to Turkey and Russia. And this agreement was the beginning of the concrete, realistic steps to be taken. Before this phase, we used to talk about the Aleppo agreement, if I may say, and it aimed at saving the lives of civilians. So we started here implementing a concrete and realistic solution And this is the Astana path that spoke realistically about solutions that could be implemented on the field, starting by a ceasefire, and then Astana meetings were held under the patronage of Turkey and Russia, in addition to Iran as a major player on the field. So the Astana process includes major stakeholders, and this is how the international or the foreign intervention shifted, because the two Syrian stakeholders started discussing and started sitting around the same table with the foreign stakeholders and started discussing these concrete steps. What were the results of the Astana meetings? Establishing calm zones. These regions were agreed upon in the last Astana meeting. The first region is Idlib. This is not only the Idlib province under the control of the regime, but we are also talking about the western Aleppo rural zone, as well as the north rural area of Aleppo, Ghouta and Dar'a. So the maps started being drawn, and they will be ratified in the upcoming meeting on June 12 and 13, 2017, in order to impose this ceasefire according to concrete steps, stipulating the need to have forces to implement this ceasefire from Iran, Turkey and Russia, in addition to Jordan in the south. So they are in charge of establishing this separation zone with a diameter of 1 kilometer. But the most important point is the following. What will happen after the ceasefire? After the ceasefire, these regions will be managed as follow. We might have additional regions, like the Suwaida region, for example, or other regions that will be annexed and included in this agreement. Those regions in the east that will be freed from ISIS thanks to the coalition headed by the United States. And we are mainly talking about Deir ez-Zor and Raqqa. They will be self-managed before the transitional phase. So all this will coincide with an American strategy that is being implemented by the United States. The United States have a clear strategy. They want, first of all, to fight terrorism, and this is what is taking place in Deir ez-Zor, and after Deir ez-Zor, the next step would be establishing calm and safe zone, stable zone. And the third objective is launching this transitional process. Therefore, the stakeholders meeting in Astana understood this strategy and took one step forward because they focused on the safe zones, the need to fight terrorism, and the need to prepare for the transitional period. So these regions will have a local authority a local authority that will revive political and security stability, and therefore we will have a political elite that is even more realistic than the political elite meeting in Geneva, and that will be able to implement a true political solution. This true political solution could be implemented by those parties, and this is what pushed the international and regional players to go to Astana, although they are convinced of the use of Geneva, but they went to Astana in order to coordinate with these internal and external players in order to launch these concrete steps that will be the beginning of a political solution, maybe not on the short term, but at least we will be launching this process. Thank you, Mr. Mohamad. I have so many questions, but I will give the floor first to Mr. Obeida Nahas, who wanted to talk about the prospects for a political solution in Syria. So we will move from the international prospects for a political solution between Astana and Geneva to the local prospects. Thank you.
Thank you, Maha. Thank you, Yezid and Mohamad. I would like to thank Carnegie Center for giving me the opportunity to take the floor. My talk will be more political because I play a political role in addition to many other roles. However, I will start talking far from the international and regional horizons about a solution in Syria or for Syria or about Syria, because there are many possibilities in order to deal with this situation. The Syrians are waiting for a penetration that would allow them to overcome the no solution perspective, and all the Syrians have different opinions. We have politicians in the opposition and others in the regime, and all of these have the obligation to come up with a political solution. However, the political solution in Syria became very complex because we started from a situation of revolution to that of an open conflict, a conflict which is very long and protracted, and we know that solutions become difficult due to the multiplicity of the actors, multiplicity of the passes, which are economic, political, etc., some of which are concomitant and others go hand in hand while others go in parallel. We know that it's very difficult to go beyond the time factor, because it's impossible for us to summarize time or to accelerate time. So sometimes it's difficult to expedite the solution. Therefore, it's necessary to take some steps and measures waiting for the other passes and itineraries to come to a solution. We are saying that we have three levels in Syria. We have an international one, a regional one, and a national one. The Geneva process reflects the international path or itinerary, where the superpowers have interests and they establish this framework in order to be able to establish a solution in light of their different interests. These superpowers do not take into consideration some of the details that follow this international level. And here we are talking about a regional conflict which is underneath the international level. And this regional conflict has a margin which is not of interest to superpowers. The Astana process was an attempt to make the superpowers contribute in Syria or participate in Syria to the attempts to come up with a solution. So in addition to all of these conflicts, we have an internal conflict in Syria, and this conflict is occurring within margins which are getting narrower with time. When we talk about a conflict, we know that we have many interests at stake. So to be able to find a solution, we need to meet the interests of the different stakeholders. However, Syrians should not surrender to the idea which says that they have to sit down and wait until a political solution or an international solution is found, because it's the Syrians themselves who will be tasked with the implementation of the political solution. Hence, the international community looks at the Syrian actors on the ground like betters look at their horses when they draw bets on their horses, but we know that without the horse we cannot have a race. So this is the card that the Syrians should play. The Syrians have to collaborate with the international and regional powers. However, they are the ones who will be playing this role on the ground, and this is a strength point in addition to a weakness point. So the Syrians who are making claims to the international powers or to regional powers in order to find a solution, this will be accepted at this level. However, this will not be accepted at the national level. I will give you an example. If a member of the Syrian opposition, one of the veterans who were victims of the Assad regime, so if one of those come today, they will be very surprised by what is going on in Geneva, because we see, for instance, a rotation between the or among the Syrians. You will see previous officials who are negotiating solutions in favor of some military factions. So there's a divergence in the distribution of roles, and there's also a change in positions. Also, these persons will find that the old opponents are now closer to the regime in dealing with terrorism and totalitarian and the totalitarian regime. So I think that this is something which could be surreal, because this is an image that we are seeing in Syria and we did not see it elsewhere. So I think also that many terms should be redefined. The regime itself is not what it was like 3 years ago, and I think that the new idea of the regime is at odds with the old one. Does it represent, for instance, one sect, one position? This is not clear. Or does it represent the remains of something that was closer to the government and became a group of conflicting interests, with some alliances which are still there because they are afraid of what we call the common enemy, which is represented by the revolution against this regime. However, do we really have a common enemy, and can we limit this common enemy to a group of persons who are against the regime? We know that there's a military situation in Syria which is represented by the military factions, but in reality in Syria, the Syrian society should be aware of the different types of conflicts. There are diplomatic, there are social, community-based conflicts. So we're not talking about the same society as the one that used to prevail in 2011, because the society changed drastically. The revolution changed the criteria. So this revolution is not a revolution like the one that was being defined by those who launched this revolution. So when the conflict becomes protracted, the situation becomes beyond control, and we had many interferences in order to support each party to exterminate the other party or to re-establish a certain balance. This is why the Syrian society became under occupation, and this is the price that the Syrian society is paying. So I think that the Syrian politicians should have to adopt a new position. We need to go beyond the current ideas that are being exchanged, because what is going on in Geneva or the Astana process are merely discussions between two parties, and they look like some media shows. And we know that classification is what is prevailing. For instance, we are classifying ourselves like the opposition, the regime, the pro-regime, or those who are against the regime, we have this whole series of classification, but we are talking also about a distribution of powers and distribution of areas in Syria. Therefore, the Syrians should look for margins which are of no interest to the regional and international actors. And in this case, or this case, was implemented in some Syrian areas. However, they are being implemented partially, and this partial implementation is leading to some militiamen leaving some areas to others, and this is leading also to a kind of reorganization of some areas. However, and unfortunately, some countries in the region are taking advantage of what is going on, or some are even being prejudiced of this situation. So it's necessary for us to try to find a national solution which is within the third level that I mentioned. That is this level which is of no interest to international and regional players. For instance, in some issues which are related to Syrians' interests, documents forced displacement from some areas based on some particular agendas under regional patronage. I think that we need to deal with those files based on the distribution of tasks, because we need to establish safety nets for all of the Syrian people by taking into consideration the national interest and not the narrow interests of the conflicting parties. If the regime does not want to give the opposition a legitimacy, and if the opposition considers that the regime is not legitimate, everyone will pay the price for this at the end of the day. And if we have a party which insists on adopting a certain policy, this party will lose control on some of the files that this party was able to manage in the past. And the same goes for the opposition. So this applies both to the opposition and to the regime. In order to find this national solution, we need to have a comprehensive political solution, and this will have to go through a Syrian public opinion, and we should have the participation also of the international players in order to find a solution for this situation. Thank you, Obeida, for these ideas. Thank you for talking about the national solution. I will now open the floor for the debate, and before opening the floor for the debate, I wanted to ask a question to Mohamad and also to yourself concerning the margins that you talked about. You mentioned in many instances those margins, and I would like to know more about the margins that you talked about. As for Mohamad, in your presentation, we noticed that you say, or you tend to say, that Astana is an acceptable alternative to Geneva. Can you tell us more about this, please? As an entry point to our debate, or probably before you answer, we could give the floor to the audience. The international and regional players are known concerning the situation in Syria. However, the Syrian parties, or the the members of the Syrian regime are known. However, who is the Syrian opposition? This is a question that we've been asking for the past 5 years. Are we talking about those who are ruling in Idlib and Daraa, or the movement which is related to Ayman al-Zawahiri? You are talking about opposition areas. This is how you are calling them. But if we keep saying that this is an opposition, and we have also the Syrians residing in Istanbul, we are saying that they are also members of the opposition. But if we mix them with those who are in Idlib, I think that we will be unfair to them, because we know that those who are in Idlib are members of Al-Qaeda. So this lack of distinction between the political opposition and the lack of stigmatization of the terrorism based on an international level is very harmful. So is it possible to make a distinction? And also we have the opposition which is saying nothing about some of the groups which are related to Al-Qaeda, and this silence will cost it a lot, especially when we're talking about the international community and not about the regime. Thank you.
Discussion was led with Dr. Yezid Sayigh.
سؤالي باللغة الإنجليزية. أنا العميد تمساح. سؤالي موجه إلى السيد يزيد صايغ. ما يتم تحضيره اليوم في البادية السورية هو حرب جديدة، حرب في الصحراء، ونعرف أن الجهات التي ستكون معنية في هذه الحرب لا تعرف شيئا عن هذه الحرب، وهذا ينطبق أيضا بالنسبة إلى الضربات الجوية وإلى القوات الجوية. هل سيتطور ذلك إلى شيء يتخطى ما يجري في الوقت الحالي بصورة تمنع القوات أو القوى العظمى من التدخل؟ سؤالي الثاني هو تالي: قبل شن الاعتداء في العراق سيما من قبل تنظيم بدر، وقبل البدء بتحرير الموصل، قال السيد أبو مهدي مهندس وأوحى أنه سيتم تشكيل بعض المجموعات لتحرير الجولان وأجزاء أخرى من سوريا. هل سيعني ذلك أن هي دعوة لإسرائيل للتدخل؟
سؤال صغير. حكيتوا عن القصة
You talked about the safe zones. I think that this should remind us of Srebrenica, what happened in Bosnia-Herzegovina, where we had massacres followed by an international intervention. Because we will have parties that will intervene, whereas they are part of the conflict. And I'm talking here about Iran and Russia. They will go in areas where they were not present before. Mr. Nahas, another question. Is it true, as I say, that the destruction in Syria was present in some areas where people built their houses in public properties and nothing will be done here? Thank you. The Astana alternative is for some persons the start of a division of Syria. This is why I wanted you to comment further on this. So in many studies we can read that many Syrians have their doubts and are suspicious about the Istana process. So could you please comment on this and comment on what Mohamad said as well? Thank you. I wanted to talk about the dangers of the Astana process. It's true that we are talking a lot about a division of the territory, and some are very scared of this division. In 1920, Syria was subject to something similar. And at the time we had many small states in Syria, and this situation lasted 2 or 3 years. However, after this we had the national bloc. The national bloc came, and here I'd like to say to my colleague Obeida that we had a call for reunifying Syria by the French, and we said that we need to preserve the unity of Syria. We do not want to have those 4 small states. We had the state of the Alawite, the state of the Druze, and of the Aleppo residents. And here I want to talk about this acceptance of the Astana process. We want to start with temporary partial solutions in order to find a permanent sustainable solution. Talking about a sustainable solution started in 2012. And in a few days, we will be talking about this for 5 years. It's been 5 years that we've been calling for the solution and that we've been discussing this solution in international fora. However, on the ground, nothing is being implemented, and there are some parties which do not want this. As Yezid said, the regime thinks that the solution in Syria will go or will require gaining again all of the territories that were lost during the past 6 years to the opposition, or the so-called opposition. I think that we need to have a partial solution. If we're not able to achieve what is hoped by the Syrians, that is changing this totalitarian regime, we need to look for partial temporary solutions in order to be able to reach a comprehensive solution later on. This is why we are accepting or approving the Astana process. And we know that the risk, or the main risk, will be distribution. And we have also Russia and Iran, which became part of the conflict. And this creates fears, especially in Daraa, where we still have fightings that are going on, and also attacks from the regime with defensive positions from the opposition. But I will give you some technical details for you to have a clearer image. So we will have a kilometer between the two parties. From our side, we will have the forces, our forces, and for the opposition we will have Turkey and Jordan, and for the regime we will have Russia and Iran. So those will be the guarantors. So there is no direct line of communication between those parties. Will they commit themselves to this? This will be discussed under the Astana process. However, there are some technicalities that each party is trying to identify. And in the course of the discussions that we had in the past, it was said that the opposition should step back for 500 meters, same for the regime, and the opposition said no, because under the first agreement they lost many areas, especially that of Barzeh. So no stepping back is achieved, and the guarantors that we are talking about should be genuine guarantors. We do not want to have a makeshift solution or a temporary solution. The question was asked about the nature of the Syrian opposition and who is the Syrian regime. The Syrian regime is no longer one bloc. Who is the decision maker? Of course, there's a form which was preserved, and we need to acknowledge this. But who is the decision maker? Who is the party which is able to govern? Is it an internal party or an external one? Are we talking about militias or about local powers? No answer to these questions. We have the opposition that has been making some statements, and the opposition said that it's against Al-Qaeda, and all Syrians and the revolution fought Al-Qaeda since the start. However, there were some groups that said that they were related to Al-Qaeda. However, they broke their relations with Al-Qaeda. So we need to know how we should deal with those different parties. We do not have a final form to deal with them. today we are talking about the Sham Liberation Movement and other similar movements, so we do not have a good base in Syria. But do we still have some cells? Yes, we do have cells. We need to acknowledge this, and we need to fight them. And this was also specified in the Astana process. So these are the answers that I had to the questions that were asked to me. Thank you. You asked a question concerning the margins. It's possible today to have some agreements or some understandings. Unfortunately, we are witnessing some negative actions. We are having displacements. Why don't we talk about the return of the refugees? And I think that this is more important for the Syrians. And we have also some regional actors which would approve this, because if the Syrians agree on the return of the refugees, this will be of good use. And this issue does not require a regional understanding, because it's an internal Syrian issue which serves more the interests of Syria. And we also have other issues such as the task distribution, concerning the necessity of ensuring security in some areas. So this distribution of tasks is made in Syria. However, it's made in a very negative way, because it's serving the direct interests of some parties. We have some lines of demarcation in the past where we used to have some smuggling in order to achieve punctual and temporary interests of one party. And this distribution of tasks could be for the interest of the people, of the Syrian people. Concerning the issue of the regime, and I mentioned in my talk that we no longer have one regime in Syria. This is no longer true. As I said, we have a form of state, and also we have a form of government that is still there. However, the regime waived many of its privileges. Electricity is no longer insured by the government. It's insured by some sellers of some voltages. So the regime also weakened its own army, and now we have many militias that are falling under the regime. And here I'm talking about the Syrian militias. I'm not talking about the external interferences. So we no longer have one body. Of course, the regime is playing the international legitimacy card, and this is helping the regime in Astana or in Geneva. And we know that the regime is able to control those which are falling under its rule. But the idea of conciliation with Al-Qaeda or Al-Nusra is not acceptable politically. And we Syrians consider that the Islamization which is imposed on us was the most prejudicial thing that happened to us. And we never had slogans in favor of Islamization, because our claims at the start were very easy and very simple. We wanted change, and the change was not the claim formulated by the opposition. It was a claim by the Syrian population. And the change that was requested in 2011 was a general and popular change, even within the circles that were closer to the government. They all said that they wanted change, and we know how the things developed later. And many persons are sticking together because they are scared of one common enemy, because they have this fear of threat. Another question concerning the destruction. It's very difficult to say that the destruction occurred in the places where people built their homes on public property. The regime destroyed what we call the popular base of the opposition. The analysis will be very long, but this analysis will be a social one, a class-based one. Why do we have some armed forces in some areas and not in others? And we noticed that some of the areas that were less fortunate were the ones which hosted the armed forces or groups. And we know that we started having grievances, feelings of injustice, and this is why some areas started hosting those people whom they thought would be defending their rights and their interests. However, not all the areas in Syria that were the victims of destruction are the areas of which belong to the government or public property where people came and built their homes. Thank you. Yezid?
يعني أنا بتفق مع كثير من ما سمعته من حيث يعني
I agree with what I have heard regarding the political solutions that are possible, all these possible transitional solutions are accepted. I'm sorry, but I will continue in Arabic. Even if we consider that the ideas you have conveyed are accurate, namely regarding the Astana process and how there's a need to build free zones, my question is, in light of this scenario, we hope to reach a true political solution. What does this mean? This means that we will have the regime represented by ministers and the opposition represented by the opposition personalities gathered around the same table talking about legislations, about the constitution. I wish this was possible. Yet, unfortunately, this is not going to happen. The ceasefire, that is something very positive and needed. In light of the latest developments and in light of the interests of foreign players, what will happen is the following, creating a new status quo. So what will happen after 6 months, 1 year, or 2 years? I was amongst the persons who talked 3 years ago about a parallel ceasefire from the two parties through the mediation of Turkey, the United States, and Russia. A general ceasefire in the Syrian regions, because this was the only way at that time and even now that was able to launch a new political dynamic in Syria, because citizens, regardless of their political affiliations, want to put an end to war and to killings. So we will have a new dynamic, and those who want to go back to war and to the battles after this ceasefire will be stopped by the persons who belong to the same groups. So I think that we should work on giving additional role to Syrian citizens, to Syrian mothers. So if we reach such a general ceasefire between all the opponents and the regime, then we will be able to create this new dynamic. Yet, even in the context of this positive framework, I'm afraid that this ceasefire framework will be transformed in a framework for everything, including political negotiation. So, for example, we have armed forces in Idlib. Let them be, because we had agreements in this region, in Daraya, in Zabadani. We have 1,200 villages where we claim that we had agreements and reconciliations. So this means that you can give us the heavy weapons and you can keep your personal weapons and remain where you are. And this will broaden the framework of action, meanings that we will be talking about reconciliations in Idlib, Daraa, Talbis, Rastan, etc. And those regions will go back to the control of the regime, provided that the local councils of these regions will have an autonomy, yet they will be linked to the Ministry of Interior, to the Ministry of Defense. So this will be a progressive integration of those regions under the umbrella of the regime. I think that this is the type of political solution that will be implemented in Syria. What differentiates Geneva from Astana is that Astana was born dead, and Geneva could pave the way for this form of political solution. I don't know what your opinion is in light of your political experience in Syria. When we repeat this dynamic and this structure, according to which we change the conflict into a pure military conflict, I think that this would lead to the situation I just described. In light of what Mr. Obeida mentioned, when he said that the regime today is different than the regime 6 years ago, and it is formed of a group of persons having specific interests. This is a habit in Lebanon. You spoke about the selling of amps in Syria, and this is something new, although we have lived in such a situation for the past 20 years in Lebanon. In all our countries in the Arab world, we have the erosion of the nation state, and we don't have a national identity. We don't have any other alternative. So even if we have peace in Syria, in the best possible scenario, we could have a ceasefire, but the absence of a state, and maybe this absence of the state will take the form of what happened in Iraq or in Lebanon, this political void, or maybe in Egypt. So the question is, and this question was asked to several Syrian politicians lately, what about 3 years or 5 years? What do you want to achieve after 3 years or 5 years? And what is the plan of the opposition in Syria? What are the programs to be implemented? Do you want to participate to the parliamentarian elections, for example? How do you want to operate? And I'm not sure that the opposition has an answer. Thank you, Yezid. I will ask Obeida and Mohamad if they have an answer to this question before concluding for today. Obeida, do you have an answer to the question of Yezid? The diagnosis of Yezid is very accurate. The political solution is taking the form of what you just described, because the international interference complicated the conflict. So I think that it's on the international arena that this solution will be created. Russia is trying to impose a specific type of solution, and regional powers are trying to invest in this prospect. We even have many geographical interests for several players, and we know that the Kurds have authority over more than 20% of the Syrian territories, and this project is expanding, and we might have other parallel projects, provinces that will not be established as per an international initiative, but as per a local initiative as well. So it is not the regime who will try to assimilate those regions. We also have other players that will compete with the regime. So any politician, to be honest, should represent the Syrian people. So if I have the interests of my political party given the priority, then I will not be serving the Syrian people. I would be transforming myself into a warlord. So the equation you spoke about is not totally refused, but the problem that is happening in all these regions is that the trust is very weak and is quasi-absent in some regions, and this is why the armed factions remained in specific regions and were allowed to leave their weapons. And in some other regions, they have preferred to leave, because leaving means that they will not be killed after a while. And this exit or this displacement is not always under the patronage of Turkey or Iran, but of Russia as well, as it is the case in Wadi Barada or War, where Russians are needed as mediators because they are more trusted, if I may say. But everything is relative in Syria. You spoke about the return of the displaced as one of those margins, and through our work here, we are working a lot with the Syrian refugees, and I think that the trust is very absent. People are refusing to go back under the current conditions because they do not trust any of the stakeholders. They want security and safety, but they do not trust the opposition, nor do they trust the regime or the regimes. This is why I spoke about the social security networks. Those security networks are platforms where the regime will try to protect its interests, yet with the participation of the opposition, because the regime cannot implement the solution by itself. So the regime will be trying to find a partner amongst the opposition, maybe, but not in Astana and Geneva. He is looking elsewhere. So to which extent do we have Syrian political parties that are ready to deal with this situation from a realistic approach? This is the question. We need to solve the problems that Syrians can find a solution to. We cannot keep waiting for Godot. Thank you, Obeida. Mohamad. Regarding the concerns for the future that were expressed by Yezid, what will the form of this final solution be? We have prepared a study regarding who's the winner and who's the loser, and we noticed that the regime and Iran are the biggest losers. Why? Because they wanted to continue fighting the opposition, and their speech stipulates that the opposition is invading Syria. So they lost this speech, and this is the biggest loss. And the regime is fighting along with the militias, and these militias will go back to the regime, which will destroy the regime from within. And this started happening in Aleppo, where we had some resistance towards specific leaders. The traders of Aleppo started refusing this reality that was imposed on them. And when we talk about these regions, we have to pay attention to the fact that the oppositions should be developing a solution on the long term and building a management system that will be the seed of the future regime in Syria. So this is how the authority will be shaped in Syria. If we found a path to walk on in the context of the political negotiations, we would have walked on this path. But we are still waiting for the Americans to sit with the Russians in order to find an agreement. Or we are waiting for the Americans to give the Mistura the green light to start. So we truly need to start by implementing concrete solutions on the field through establishing these zones, and through the establishment of these zones, an active political elite will emerge. And whenever we have a political solution, it will be shaped by this political elite itself. This is a very important point that will pave the way for a final solution. From my personal opinion, I don't think that the final solution will be reached by two parties, but by a group of parties having an impact on the field and meeting in order to build the future Syrian state. Thank you, Mohamad. I would like to thank Mohamad, Obeida, and Yezid for this very interesting discussion. And we hope to hold a similar discussion in Syria soon. I would like to thank the
joining us and staying with us till
After
quite a
slow
while,
start.
after a very slow start, yes. شكرا جميعا.